I am Nicole Owens from MedTech. If you're not familiar with the organization, we are a trade association that works to bolster the medical device industry, primarily in the New England area through education, advocacy, connection, and awareness. Today, we have a great webinar for you. We're going to be talking about the future of MedTech, trends and opportunities in 2025, brought to you from our friends at Greenberg Torek. I do have a couple of housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our moderator for today. This webinar is being recorded, so anyone who registered for the webinar will get a link after this ends, and we are going to have time for conversation. So anytime you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer them in the time allotted. All right, without further ado, I am pleased to turn it over to AJ Tibbetts. He is a shareholder at Greenberg Torek, and he's going to be our moderator for today's session. AJ.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Dialing in from San Francisco myself. I've been here so far this week. I'll be here for a few more days this week for JPM, the unofficial kickoff of the year for everyone. And we're here to look back at 2024, look ahead at 2025, talk about what's happening this week so that everybody can account for it in their strategic plans for the week. We've got people talking from various segments of the MedTech market, and love to get into that discussion. As Nicole just shared, we will have Q&A at the end. The Q&A function in the webinar is already active. I've got the box open here. If you have a question that's relevant to something that's being discussed, I'll just chime it in then. Otherwise, we will hold questions for the end, but please don't be shy with that. Just we'll do introductions quickly. Since I'm already speaking, I'll touch on mine quickly first. I'm a shareholder in the intellectual property group at Greenberg Traurig, based in the Boston office. I have sat on the MedTech board, and my particular focus is on digital health, healthcare, IT, some med device, tech bio, computational bio, et cetera. I was a software engineer before going into law, and so my practice focuses on the intersection of healthcare, medicine, life sciences, and software. Continuing with introductions, I'd love to bring Irina Ridley into the conversation, Chief Legal Officer at Aaron Medical, who had some of their own good news this week as part of the announcements kicking off JPM. But Irina, if you could introduce yourself and Aaron.
Sure. Thanks, AJ. Candidly, I'm not sitting in San Francisco. I'm actually sitting in my house just outside of Boston right now. I woke up under the weather on Sunday and I'm missing what I think is my first JPM of my career. So very sad about that, but tried to keep up as best I can and excited to be here with all of you today. But as AJ mentioned, I am the Chief Legal Officer at Aaron Medical. We're a company with two commercial products in the ENT space, one for nasal airway obstruction and the other for chronic rhinitis. I've been in this role since just May of 2024. Prior to that, I was the Chief Legal Officer of NeuroPace, a company that I took public in April 21. And I'm sure that time frame will come in at times throughout our conversation as the last real kind of IPO class. But they have an implantable brain device for epileptic seizures. I've been in healthcare my entire career, obviously with the last number of years in med device. Prior to that, I was in diagnostics, selling a company called Counsel to Myriad Genetics and leading that integration. Prior to that, I was in digital health. And prior to that, really kind of covered the gamut across life sciences in management consulting, first at Deloitte and then at PwC. And I'm excited to be here with all of you today.
Great. Thank you, Irina. And Tom Busby, Director at Outcome Capital, a Boston-based investment bank focusing on life sciences. Tom, if you can introduce yourself and a little bit more about Outcome.
Absolutely, AJ. It's a pleasure to be here. By way of introduction, as AJ mentioned, my name is Tom Busby. I'm a director at Outcome Capital, a highly specialized life sciences and healthcare dedicated strategic advisory and investment banking group. We cover really all of the life science primary verticals, from biotech to pharma, medical device, of course, diagnostics, laboratories and instrumentation, as well as all of the service providers above, around, and beside those verticals as well, which I think is particularly important for the MedTech members as well. There's a lot of activity within the service segments as well. At Outcome Capital, we primarily advise on merger and acquisition transactions, to a lesser extent, assist companies with capital raising initiatives, and also assist investors, family offices, and private equity groups on strategy development, portfolio management, and thesis creation. Thanks a lot for having me here today, AJ.
Oh, thanks, Tom. And David Dykman, my colleague at Greenberg Traurig, chair of our life sciences and MedTech practice. Dave, you could introduce yourself and the life sciences group.
Everybody, Dave Dykman. I'm sitting in Greenberg Traurig's San Francisco office. As AJ mentioned, I co-chair our life sciences and medical technology practice, which has about 200 members across the law firm's 48 offices around the world. I've been coming to JP Morgan for over 20 years. And I think from the big picture, I can give people who aren't here a few indicators of JP Morgan in San Francisco. Hotels are still ridiculously expensive. Somehow they can keep going up this week, and they'll go to 1/3 or 1/5 their price starting for the weekend. So it's a good time to visit San Francisco after this conference. The weather has been amazing. We had a reception last night for our clients and contacts that was packed with people, which is, I think, another good sign, but it did not rain. Usually it always rains on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and it hasn't this year. And I think the other thing to take away is that there's a lot of optimism on the streets and in the receptions and in the meetings. And I think we'll get into that, but there is I think a positive outlook for 2025 with a little bit of uncertainty mixed in to keep things interesting.
Great. I'd love to jump off that and into the substantive part of the webinar with Tom. I saw you nodding as Dave was saying, there's a lot of optimism on the streets or cautious optimism. I think when we were having this webinar last year, we were talking about, we were optimistic that we would be optimistic. And so I'd love to hear what the tone is in conversations this year and what things are looking like in your part of the market.
So AG, I am boots on the ground here in San Francisco. We miss you, Arena, out here in the Bay Area, but it really has been a good conference. It's a funny thing that Dave mentioned, the weather. So almost every conversation that you have in every meeting, people bring up, it's not raining this year. And I don't know if it's startling to find how much the weather can impact optimism and moods, but this is certainly a great way to start the year. On a more serious note, though, today was a big earnings report day for our economy. And this past year has really been gangbusters. And so especially Q4, we've really seen a lot of positive trends. And I think that you're seeing that here primarily from the investors, really, especially mid-stage investors. The M&A environment last year really started to kick off when J&J took down Shockwave. And then as we've started to continue through that, I think you're feeling reverberations as well. Last year, there was a lot of talk about what people wanted to do. This year, it's a lot of talk about what people are actually doing. So, we look for a lot of signals when it comes to raising capital and M&A. It's a good signal when we're meeting with strategics and they're saying, we're actually adding new personnel and bandwidth to our corporate development and business development teams. That's a strategic move to say, we want to see more deals. We want to be more actionable. Strategics are still incredibly sensitive to any sort of EPS dilution. I think that the companies that are being bought are true companies with sales forces and not just product companies, which is what we saw more of the last 5 to 7 years. And on the capital markets front, AI is all the flavor right now, from really being a savior within digital health to a lot of AI applications in drug development. And so investors, when they look at what happened last year in technologies between GLPs and AI technologies, they're saying, this is a great time for a new vintage of companies to be doing Series A's.
It's great to hear. And Arena, I know, as I mentioned earlier, Aaron had its own good news at the kickoff of the conference. So what are things looking like in your portion of the MedTech industry?
Yeah, well, first, I'm now even more sad not to be there. I was mentioning before my JP Morgan shoe cemetery. So the Monday, Tuesday shoes always go into a bucket, and I keep that bucket as a prized possession. I guess I would not have contributed to that bucket this year, but so anyway, sad to miss it. But I think what Tom said is spot on. That's based on everything I've seen and heard. That's the way that things are trending. I think for us, we were excited to announce on Monday morning that we closed 2 rounds of financings. One, on the equity side, we raised $32.5 million, primarily from very reputable existing MedTech investors that had invested in Aaron previously. We also brought in additional funding from Ares Management, who also led our debt round. So we were able to refinance our existing term loan and have accessibility to additional funding that can help us fuel growth in the future. You know, it's interesting to see. Obviously, we're a pretty late stage company at this point. We had a lot of very interested parties from across kind of the gamut of different types of investors. I think there was a significant appetite and interest in, in working with us. And so I think that's indicative of kind of where the market is. I think for late stage companies for the last, certainly the last year, but even probably beyond that, it's been pretty hard to raise capital. I think investors just didn't know when or how to see an exit. I think there is a light at the end of that tunnel. I think, as Tom said, on the capital market side, things are opening up. We saw 2 IPOs in MedTech at the tail end of last year. Prior to that, the last IPO was 3 years ago. I think NeuroPace was one of the very last companies to go public, and saw kind of its fair share of trials and tribulations after that, as many small cap MedTechs did when from that class. So I think there's been a lot of, consternation around what that looks like, and people are trying to see how, those last 2 IPOs fare before they really throw their hats in the mix. I think that, on the M&A side, things are definitely picking up. And so, investors are far more, or I think, definitely more inclined to work with later stage companies expecting to see some sort of exit and some sort of a return in the more near term than they were expecting to see in the last couple of years. So that's been exciting and certainly made the process far more enjoyable. And we were very happy with how it turned out at the end. So, all good news.
Great. And Dave, I'd love to ask for your thoughts, but Tom, if I can jump back to you, we've talked a little bit about the late stage segment of the market. I'm curious what we might be seeing for earlier stage. You mentioned a little bit about might be a good time for some Series A companies in particular markets, but for companies that aren't yet at that late stage, or for investors who are operating in that market, what do you think things are looking at like for 2025?
So I think to answer the question going forward, you need to look back a little bit, AJ. So through COVID times and then late COVID times, with the low interest rate environment, you had a hyperactive deal scenario. Now you have some companies that are arguably a bit overvalued in terms of private markets, and they're having a hard time raising that Series B, Series C. Irene, I see you smiling, so I'm sure you can appreciate where that's going. The last 12 to 18 months arguably have been more of a market clearing function, both for what are the management teams that have the goods to really, bring technologies to market. And then as the technologies themselves have been put in the marketplace, are they being adopted? Are physicians using them? And we're seeing some dynamics play out where physicians and medical device companies want to see the patient go back to the doctor. It's not everything can be done virtually. And so I think that you're also seeing a lot of patient pathways start to develop. What this means is that for an entrepreneur who's considering raising a Series A this year, I would argue that the environment is actually much more hospitable to you and willing to really fund you as opposed to, let's say, a year ago. And a lot of that is predicated on what Irina mentioned, which is we have not had liquidity in private markets. And so investors need to see exits, they need to see M&As, they need to see IPOs, they need to see build to buys. And if they don't, no matter how bullish they are about the companies, they can't compel their LPs to really want to participate. Now I think for entrepreneurs that are especially looking at AI technologies and seeing where is the puck going in healthcare and not just being hyper-focused on the aberration of COVID, that's where we're seeing success.
Great.
And I think that's Tom. I think that's really good insight. I think I think hopefully the Aaron deal that Irina talked about is kind of the leading indicator. It's a great announcement, raising 32.5 million in equity plus some debt. That's a really nice round, and kudos to Aaron. And I think, you know, the way that I look at JPM is there's always the Monday morning announcements. And I think while we're obviously focused on MedTech, I think just taking a quick look at the bigger picture, life sciences in general and biopharma is, I think, hopefully a good sign for MedTech and the entire healthcare industry. You know, we saw M&A was some huge announcements. J&J acquired Intracellular Therapies for a whopping $14.6 billion, which was the largest biotech deal since 2023. So we've already passed, you know, the biggest deal of 2024 in the first week of January. There were a couple other billion-dollar deals. Eli Lilly, $2.5 billion purchase of Scorpion Therapeutics. GSK had $1 billion acquisition of IDRX. Both were focused on, you know, innovative cancer treatments. So I think M&A, there's a lot of activity, a lot of headlines. And I think if you bring that back to MedTech, it's interesting. I think Stryker kind of got the jump on JP Morgan on January 6th. They announced, you know, their nearly $5 billion, $4.9 billion to be exact, you know, deal to buy NRE Medical, arterial thrombectomy system. And, you know, this was a big deal, a big move for Stryker, a great move for the MedTech industry. And I think, as was alluded to earlier, this is M&A of like real operating companies that have been de-risked, that have shown market penetration on the sales and the ramp that the big MedTech companies are willing to pay a premium for. But I think it's great. And I think going back even to 2024, we saw M&A at the end of last year that was great. You know, Bausch & Lomb acquired Elios Vision on December 11th, minimally invasive glaucoma using an excimer laser. You know, a great outcome. I think the ophthalmic space is something that we should watch in 2025. So I think it seems, you know, there's a lot of activity in life sciences, which can only help boost the MedTech sector and medical device sector, and hopefully that continues.
And I think it's, you know, activity is definitely one indicator, but there's definitely, you know, Tom, I think you mentioned it a little bit. There's also talk of activity and planning for it. You know, Zimmer was talking about, you know, being far more, you know, invested in M&A, and this year they, you know, they mentioned kind of looking at deals that are up to 2 billion, not necessarily, you know, tuck-ins, which they were focused on before. I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see, because certainly, you know, every strategic you talk to still says, I want a big accretive deal. But I think the appetite for something more interesting has changed a little bit as well. And I think, you know, if it's not accretive immediately, you know, having a pathway to profitability, kind of being able to see, you know, profitability in the near term has become a little bit more interesting to some of the strategics, at least from what I've heard. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that evolves.
I think part of this, Turing, and couldn't agree more, is that sometimes I think and Dave, you bring up entrepreneurs and early stage companies. We want to believe that macroeconomic events really don't impact us. But last year with rising interest rates, the result was that large strategics were largely divesting less profitable business units. And so you had separation between more therapeutic assets and more monitoring technologies, which the multiples are very different. So last year was a lot of divestitures and companies cleaning up their P&Ls. This year, I agree, it's about how do I expand my portfolio and sort of embrace this new identity that I've been working on over the last year. I need to be fiscally disciplined, but if I don't launch new innovation, I'm going to lose the much bigger picture here.
Right.
Edwards was a great example. You know, their 2 cardiac acquisitions, those were built to buy deals, highly strategic. That came on the heels of very large divestitures. So I think now we're getting into more value enhancing M&A as opposed to sort of corporate cleanup.
Right, and I'll just chime in on some of the conversations I've been having this week to resonate with a couple points that have been raised. A little bit of a shift of what we were just talking about, but coming back to AI, which is based on what I said earlier about what my background and my practice is, most of the conversations I'm having this week, it's a little bit different tenor than the conversations I was having last year. Last year, people were just really interested in hearing anything there was about AI. You know, it was a shift away from telemedicine from the couple of years before that. People were still interested in how software was impacting the market. but seeing that was a way to get money and get interest and get, strategic partnerships and et cetera, I think a lot of people just sort of shoved AI into their products. And so investors and potential partners and others are just approaching it a little bit more cautiously this year. People are still interested in AI, still interested in the promise of it, still looking for how they can expand their product offerings to include digital and software, but they're looking more carefully at those opportunities and making sure it's not just vaporware, and also looking for what's the ROI. And it's been an interesting shift, working with a lot of digital companies over the years. Some of them really did not understand the healthcare market in the US, did not understand the three-part split between patient, provider, and payer, didn't figure out how to align their ROI with their business. And we're seeing, I think, less and less of that. People are getting the message. And it might be that we're seeing more traditional tech players a little bit more cautious about jumping into the healthcare market. So,
yeah. And I think, AJ, that was a great, and Tom, a great summary of hot areas. And I think where we're seeing, I think, AI having a huge impact and continuing is, I think, surgical robotics. I think that's, going to be the area that in 2025 where we're just going to see more and more of it. I think on the early stage, there are more and more surgical robotics companies coming into the market and garnering investment. Obviously, Intuitive is the market leader there, but there are so many different procedures that there's room for that. So I think surgical robotics, computer vision, spatial computing, ways to make surgeries easier. There is a lot of opportunity, whether it's orthopedic, ENT, neuro. There's a big need for this, and it really does improve patient outcomes.
I think that's absolutely right. But I think, if you look beyond, MedTech, certainly, you saw NVIDIA and kind of the, their announcements, IQVIA and Illumina on the genetics front, Mayo and digital pathology. So I think it's, across the space, it's going to be huge. And I read somewhere, I guess, I got two different facts. 37% of all 2024 deals were AI focused. And, AJ, I think the one correction to your point, it's not that the companies necessarily were trying to do AI. I think they were throwing AI as a buzzword in their pitch deck to get funding.
right.
But I agree. I think, investors have certainly gotten smarter, and I think the actual utility of that AI is going to be very important to demonstrate. I think, between your three-party mix in the healthcare system, I think another area for AI is going to be around, the claims data and all the work on the payer side. I think that'll certainly impact MedTech to a large degree, as well as the rest of the space. But, all the work that's being done there will be interesting to see how that helps shape reimbursement for all of our products.
So thinking back to this conversation last year, we had this webinar at JPM last year, so looking forward at the year. We were obviously talking about AI a lot for all of these same reasons. One of the other things that came up pretty often was GLP-1s and GIPs, and looking at what impact they might have on the market. Some people were worried about it potentially, addressing patient problems before they arose, and so they would no longer be, potential patients for the MedTech market. Other people had other views. I'm curious, Tom, what was your view on how that impacted 2024?
So the GLP story, I think, is one that is incredibly interesting that, at least in my mind, did not garner near enough attention. So when GLPs were first launched, you saw many MedTech companies' stock take a nosedive, with the idea that if we've cured the weight problem, have we also cured things like diabetes, cardiac events, strokes? Are we going to see a decline in the need for orthopedic surgery, so on and so forth? But what ended up happening, and I actually attribute this to Mick Farrell more than anyone else over at ResMed, who did the work, and they said, actually, this is going to expand our addressable market, because we are going to have more patients that are going to take more of an interest in their health, be open to tackling their sleep apnea problems as well as other issues. Similar for invasive cardiac procedures. One of the leading deterrents to having patients really get into that surgery is you need a level of weight loss. Bariatric surgery, I've heard figures that it's going to grow by 40% this year, because again, the leading deterrent to getting that surgery done was weight loss. So I actually think that these drugs have been a market enhancing technology for many medical device companies. And that's where I think you see medical device companies also marketing themselves a bit more directly to the consumer to say, come on in, get these procedures done. Let's help you get healthy back out there playing golf, tennis, and paddleball.
And I think even looking at the GLP-1s, and obviously there are more drugs, more similar drugs coming onto market. The uptake of those is continuing. It's something that I don't think should be lost on us. While there are incredible medical devices, there's also pen needles and syringes, and things like that, which are, manufactured and, can be very profitable for the deliverers of those. And if people, more and more people doing GLP-1s, they need more and more of the medical supplies that are necessary for those. So I think, there was an initial kind of sky is falling, but I think there's always a silver lining as you get more and more into it.
There was definitely an initial skies falling. I mean, at this point I was at NeuroPace and, all of MedTech was down. GLP-1 impact on epilepsy, arguably not very, high, but it was very interesting to see. But, I think I agree with everything that's been said. You saw Lilly miss its revenue this year, which, is interesting and is an interesting data point for kind of their GLP-1 sales. But I think all the ancillary businesses, I think that will continue. I think the focus on weight and health has, I think GLP-1s have had a huge impact on that. And I think, you look at companies like Omada Health, which initially was a company focused on, and I worked there candidly, on pre-diabetes, and now has really pivoted and really focused on kind of the GLP-1s and working with, self-insured plans and getting the right people to the GLP-1s and helping them stay the course and stay on track and get the right benefits from those drugs. I think all of those companies will really benefit and continue to grow and evolve based on kind of this new area of focus and interest.
And if I could, Dave, you hit on an important point, kind of the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about, which is private equity's impact on the medtech sector. And it is a very real impact. And that's where many of the meetings I've had with private equity investors are focused on bioprocessing and then also medical device design, development, and manufacturing. We haven't talked about the new administration coming in and the impact there, but we are certainly seeing a retrenching to United States manufacturing, and private equity very excited to address the demand for GLP drugs and take that one.
So as a good a transition as any, we're going to touch on, what were the potential points of uncertainty in 2025 and what's the outlook for 2025. So let's start with the incoming administration and how people are thinking about that, either at your companies or the conversations that you're having, and what do you think is going to be the direct impact on the market?
I'll defer to Dave to give the first answer on that one, maybe.
Just hot potato it right to Dave.
Yeah, what a guy, Tom. I appreciate that one. I think I would say, and I try to keep things simple. I think what we're seeing so far in 2025 is a lot of optimism with, a nice dose of uncertainty at the end. And I think the uncertainty, in my mind, there's a couple big buckets, and we touched on them, is what's going to happen in the IPO market. If that can get heated up, if that can get some momentum, that gives the venture capital and VC, that gives them the confidence to make those earlier stage investments and to get some return on, their investments to reinvest in the industry. So I think IPO uncertainty is the big question in my mind. And then obviously we are just a few days away from the inauguration on Monday, and there's been an incredible amount of talk of a lot of things being done, on day one. So I think that's the other piece of uncertainty, is what are things going to look like at the FDA, NIH, reimbursement, and we just don't know. But there's a lot of talk, but we'll see. And I think things in Washington, they just change very slowly, even no matter how fast you want to. So I think it's just going to be very interesting. And I know, Tom, you've kind of have a good sense of that. So I'll flip it back to you with your take on how the new administration might impact MedTech.
So the simplest and most honest answer, of course, is no one knows. But if we try to prognosticate what we know right now, I think there's also murmurings of what to expect in years past. So I would actually start with Europe. MDR has made it very difficult for medical device companies to operate there. So I was at MedTech Malta last fall, and that was the pervasive sentiment, is MDR has been really hard for young innovative companies and large strategics to operate. So it used to be the case that you would raise funds here in the US, you develop your prototype, then you do your trial and get your CE mark in Europe, leverage that data, come back to the US, and then go for an acquisition. Nowadays, we're seeing investors prefer to have those medical device companies do their trials here in the United States and have all the development be here. It was actually COVID I would point to, where you had many strategics run into supply chain issues and start to bring a lot of their manufacturing back to the United States. So the tariffs, if they do materialize, are certainly going to have an impact on our supply chains and the ability to continue to make products at appropriate cost. But this is where, again, I look to what is private equity investors doing. Many European investors who are actionable here in the US are going back to Europe and then looking to Asia to do more deals. US investors are doubling down, and that's where I think you're going to see massive consolidation in the contract design manufacturing space, because they're seeing far more of a demand for US made products. Whether or not we're going to see President Trump actually take action on some of his promises, the jury is out. But I think that the market is already bracing for what has been discussed.
Irina?
And Irina, as a medical device company, how do you plan for administration change, and how do you guys, plan out for 2025 with this uncertainty looming?
Yeah, I mean, candidly, I think for us, the impact is going to be relatively small. The one thing I wanted to add to your slew of acronyms that you threw out earlier, Dave, is, the FTC. I think the one part that we haven't talked about is, deals certainly under the last administration were somewhat hard to come by. And I think some of that, certainly on the IPO side, it'll be interesting to see, and I think it'll be a better climate for IPOs. I think similarly on the M&A side, I think with HSR and changes to HSR and kind of and changes to some of the FTC requirements around M&A, I think that'll open the door to some more deals that otherwise either wouldn't have happened, would have been really slow or really complex or really expensive to get done. And so I think that's going to be something interesting to watch as well.
And one of the conversations I'm having lately is with the change in administration, potential change in regulatory posture, what's going to happen with, say, the focus that there has been lately on health equity from a regulatory perspective. Lots of discussions during the campaign about change in AI regulation, and particularly things in that space. Looking at it from a healthcare perspective, specifically, I'm not sure how much of an impact there's going to be, because the focus on health equity at the end of the day comes back to a patient safety and accuracy perspective. And so I think we might see a change in terminology, but the outcome might be the same. Obviously, it comes back to Tom said, none of us really know what's going to happen. Like, you give the lawyer answer of, we've just got to wait and see what the facts come out as. But looking at it from the outcome-focused regulation, it might be, a little bit of a window dressing change on some things. I'm curious about other trends from 2024 into 2025. We talked a lot about the investment market and what the business outlook is, but I'm curious if anybody has thoughts on particular segments of the market that seem like they're more hot right now, or that might garner more interest from patients, buyers, hospital systems, or other areas of demand. So what's looking hot right now as we go into 2025?
I don't know if it's looking hot, but I'm curious. There's certainly a lot of talk and a lot of buzz around women's health and, investment in women's health related businesses. Tom, I think this is more actually a question for you. Where do you see that going in 25?
It's a great question, Irina, and I'm not sure that my answer is going to be what everyone wants to hear. Even when the conditions were better for the women's health segment, I think you still unfortunately saw a real challenge there. Areas that we are certainly starting to see interest in are things like, making sure that women are getting better mammograms done when they need to be done and easing the burden there. I do also think that there is far more consideration for that patient's experience in terms of listening to what the patients actually want and what their pathways are and so on and so forth. Having done a lot of work in women's health, there are very bullish investors, but it tends to still be a bit of a niche arena, as I'm sure that you can see and sort of appreciate there. I think also the challenge is that you had a few women's health companies materialize through COVID on the digital health side, which have had now a hard time kind of taking that next step. So the trend from last year that's going to continue to this year is the expectation that an entrepreneur can develop a technology and a strategic will buy it and figure out the commercial pathway just isn't happening. And so for entrepreneurs in the space, and I would actually expand this, is it used to be the case, for instance, if you're looking for a 510K, what is the lowest data hurdle that I need to get over to get approval? And now you see investors saying, actually, I want to know what would be the best trial to really run to give us the best data set, and then perhaps give us a runway for future users of the technology. So being far more strategic and understanding that my regulatory, commercial, and development cycle are far more hand in hand than used to be the case.
What about the reimbursement piece, actually, now that you throw that? I mean, I feel like, a lot of the data, I think that, strategics also want to see is data that's going to support reimbursement.
So remote patient monitoring is an area that, year after year, I think there's been step downs in reimbursement and challenges of what are the parameters that really need to be monitored on a patient after a procedure. That's where I think you're seeing reimbursement challenges more on the digital health side, to be very candid there. Yeah. When it comes to procedures being done in the office, that's also where I think that our system is trying to make it a better existence in life for nurses and healthcare workers coming out of COVID. So I'll give you an example. We did a deal with Cardinal Health recently, and it was amazing to hear them talk about how important it is that the nurses and the healthcare providers and the physicians that use the technology really like it. They can't keep forcing new technologies on healthcare providers. They really want that buy-in. And so I think that's where we're seeing a bit more of a holistic approach in that sense of it, maybe.
Right, Tom, you and I were having a conversation recently about struggles in the digital health market and sort of the gap closing between consumer health and digital health. I was curious if you could share some of that conversation for the audience. So.
Yeah, it's been the last few years has, I think, been challenging for some companies that are trying to straddle sort of I'm a clinically oriented company, but I also want to participate in sort of consumer health. Myself and many of my colleagues at Outcome hold the view that you really can't do both. There are consumer health companies, and then there are clinical companies and life sciences companies. The exceptions there would be groups like, let's say, Hims and Hers and some specialty pharma groups that do market directly to consumer, but that's a limited array of products that can be sold directly to consumer. So for instance, if you're having a thrombectomy procedure, you're not going to be talking to your physician about, hey, I'd rather use this device than that one. So we're never going to see that sort of marketing ploy. Where I do find it to be really interesting, though, is in the diabetes segment, where you have companies like Abbott and Insulet and others that market directly to patients because they're fighting to get those patients into their systems. So where and when it's appropriate for the right disease and patient population, I think that's where the direct-to-consumer works, because you need to market there. But most medical device companies, in my view, have no business thinking about, I need to, do a consumer sort of play here and talk. The other hard part is for investors, there's just very different valuations ascribed to consumer health companies as opposed to true life science companies. And so for those entrepreneurs that are thinking, hey, to get through the FDA, that bar is so high and the capital requirements are so stringent, maybe I can kind of round the corner and go consumer. Can't say that I've ever seen that strategy work. And it's because you're also raising from very different capital pools as well. So life science investors do not want to be in the same cap table as a consumer health investor typically.
I think, Tom, kind of an aside, I thought one of the most interesting things we saw at the end of the year was, Zimmer Biomet getting Arnold Schwarzenegger as one of their sponsors, and I think that it was interesting. I think it's kind of a little outside the box, right? Everybody knows the Terminator, and he looks good, but he's getting up there in age, and that's Zimmer's does so much with replacement joints and fixing joints. I thought that was a very interesting kind of advertisement, if you will, or partnership. So
would totally agree there, Dave, for sure. One area I would say too that we're seeing a little bit of action as well is in the NICUs as well. I think that you have strategics looking for, are there areas within the hospitals that we haven't seen a lot of innovation that we can do some tuck-in acquisitions for? And so I think women's health, actually, Ryan, I would say, is in that realm as well. Hologic's been really active. They're dedicated to the practice, but it's about making sure that the technology that's being launched is really going to have a market to adopt it.
Well, on the hospital side, also all the AI capabilities, right? And really looking at different, both on kind of surgical planning as well as just operational and things like that, I think have become really, really key.
That's been a huge area of interest, actually, I would say, is helping surgeons pre-op and post-op plan better for this. So we see a lot of that in orthopedics right now. How is it that you can reduce the time that a patient is under anesthesia or that the surgeon is actually performing the surgery if they can do a lot better planning prior to?
Right.
That's an area as well that you have physicians, payers, and the hospitals all in lockstep saying
All
this.
aligned, yeah.
Yes, which is hard to get. And so that's an area that I'd say too, that for companies that are looking, where do I go? Pre-op, post-op is a big opportunity.
Well, and I think that especially now, everything I'm seeing is procedure volumes are continue to be up. I think the COVID bolus is probably behind us at this point, but it looks like procedures are are still trending upwards, maybe because people not necessarily delayed, but just didn't think about procedures or didn't go to doctors to know that they needed them. So I think as all of that continue, that that trend continues, it just becomes more important to figure out how to operationalize all that.
I'd also be remiss to not mention that we have a huge mental health crisis here in the United States. I mean, we're in San Francisco, so you're seeing things that you don't see around the country always. But that is a real area of unmet need that we aren't seeing enough progress being made. And so again, for those entrepreneurs saying kind of where do I go and attack, that is a nut that has yet to be cracked, is the mental health challenge, particularly on depression and anxiety. And it spans all generations as well. When you look at the data, from seniors to college students really need help.
Yeah, and I think, Tom, that's a great point. And I think that's an area too, the mental health, addressing mental health, it's a systemic problem, but also, behavior modification, tying it all together, even with GLP-1s, they're finding that that's great. In some ways, it's the shortcut to lose weight. But unless you really have behavior modification, change your diet, exercise more, the results aren't, they're not everlasting. And, the GLP side effects, I think we're seeing people, they like the results, but the process is not perfect. And then once they get off, unless they really have, a lot of behavior modifications, kind of some neuro changes, those go hand in hand with the GLP-1s. And that, that's, I think, we're seeing a lot of that if you group that broadly in the mental health crisis. I think that's an area we're seeing a lot of entrepreneurs there. There's a lot of apps out there. And, I think more and more even employers are looking at them to try to figure out how to help people before it becomes a crisis and hits their insurance bottom line, and do things that are, less invasive than taking the injections.
And then maybe add on that one that one of the more depressing trends of last year was seeing digital therapeutics sort of bottom out, if you will. That was a sector, AJ, that I think you and I had done some work in, and I was totally bullish when I started to see those companies spring up and, really believed in what they could offer, and the data was there. Last year, you saw one digital therapeutics company after another struggle to get financing, struggle to be acquired, struggle to substantiate their existence. Much of that, I think the fingers get pointed at. You had a device being sold almost like a therapeutic, like a pharma. And so that sales cycle was different for physicians, but that was tough to see last year. And so I would be surprised to see digital therapeutics start to come back this year, given kind of the sentiment that's out there right now.
I think the one, I completely agree, but I think that especially through COVID, there was just such a plethora of digital health companies that came up that, I don't think they quite knew what they were doing. And so I think, and again, just as AI was a hot buzzword for a while and people were throwing it out to see if it, to see what sticks. I think that happened with digital therapeutics. And so the one maybe saving grace to the thinning out is that the companies that, have been able to really focus and pivot and kind of figure out what they're actually doing, I think they're still doing it and doing it well, and and have been able to get funding and have been able to succeed. So I agree. I think as a category, we want, it'll be, it was strange to see what happened, and we kind of and unfortunate in a way, but also it did kind of pave the way for the companies that actually had a real focus and a real business plan to continue doing that.
I really hope that you're right, Arena, and that it was just we needed the first vintage, unfortunately, to kind of figure out all the problems, and the second one's going to come and solve it. But no, totally agree on that for sure.
In general, since we've been talking about mental health, we've been talking about remote monitoring and the code stepping down. I think there might be a shift in attitude away from remote treatment and telehealth and more toward direct interaction, which the two just are in tension with resource provision and getting people back into the room to see their providers face to face and treating everybody, because there's not enough to go around for too many of these areas, including mental health, which is why you started to see the telemedicine, why you started to see mental health support from digital therapeutics come up. And I'm not sure it's fully gone, but the market's trying to figure itself out. So we've got about 10 minutes left. If anyone out there has questions they want to submit for the panelists, please start to do so. But I'd love to sort of move toward wrapping up. I'm curious if everybody can sort of give the general summary on 2025 and what you think we're going to be talking about at JPM next year. We're looking back at what happened in 25. So Dave, we could start with you. What do you think 2025 is going to bring?
I looked back at my notes from the webinar when we did this last year, 1 year ago, and in my summary, I said it was 2 words. It was cautiously optimistic. I think that still holds true, but I think 2024 kind of showed, I think at JP Morgan last year, I think there was exuberant optimism, but some of the things didn't change as much. The IPO market didn't open as much. M&A picked up throughout the year. It gained steam. And I think this year, I think there is optimism again. I'm a pretty realist, practical. I want to see the results. I would love to get some momentum here and have it not be hopeful optimism, but true optimism and true momentum would be great. But I think there is this uncertainty we talked about from the inauguration, from the IPO market, that I think could kind of weight things down and kind of make it a year that was similar to last year.
Marina?
I mean, I think that's spot on. Proof's in the pudding, and we'll see what it all looks like. But I do think, I do think that based on what we've seen so far, that the market is picking up a little bit. We'll continue to at least, stay the course of where we are right now. I think with interest rate cuts, with kind of this pent up demand, and hopefully better, economic landing. I think that hopefully, we'll see a little bit more of a trend up in the IPOs. I think we're already seeing that on the M&A side. And so I'm hoping that's indicative of a positive year for obviously, the larger companies, but also for the smaller companies, the companies both kind of that are trying to go public, the companies that are, an earlier stage looking for private financing. I think, again, cautiously optimistic, but hopeful that that things are trending in that direction.
Tom?
My opinions are probably of not too much value, but I can give you sort of what data points that we have. So concluding 2024, our team had clients going under LOI, a lot of deal activity, and compression on diligence phases. So where you would see an M&A diligence maybe being 3 to 4 months, we have buyers and private equity saying, I want to try to do this in 45 days and move efficiently. When you have buyers and investors and all the players sort of saying, we're going to do deals and we're going to move quickly, those are the signals that you want to see. We're also starting to get a bit of an M&A backlog right now of companies that believe that they're at an inflection point, want to run a dual process of raising capital or going the M&A route, and a lot of strategic partnerships coming down the pike as well, with good upside for the targets themselves. I think that this year is going to be an incredibly actionable year for private equity in the CDMO space, design development space, and regulatory. So I mentioned it before. I very much believe this is going to be a very hot year in terms of consolidation there. And I think in terms of fundraising as well, capital efficiency is in vogue. Making sure, and Irina, you mentioned it, not everything should be done through equity dollars. If you need to do a large inventory buildup, that's best done via debt. And so I think that the management teams that are a bit more fiscally responsible and savvy are being rewarded in capital markets for sure.
Thanks, everyone. We've had a few questions come in, and so one is on the fundraising side. Person said that they've seen the term barbell investment market thrown around, where angel money at the sort of early stage of the spectrum is freeing up, and we're seeing big deals happening later in the stage, but the middle is a little bit difficult, and so they wanted to hear your thoughts on that view on the investment market.
I can just say, Jay, on that one, I mentioned it before, for companies that are doing Series B and C, you probably raise your Series A in like 22. And now you're running out of capital and you're not really in deep revenues and you're certainly not profitable. And so when investors look and they say, all right, I've got a Series A with a very low valuation and an innovative technology, and then I've got a Series D to look at where the company is just about break even or profitable and close to an exit, that's the focus areas. For those companies in that middle space, it's a great term to use, and I absolutely think it encapsulates the environment that we're in right now. So yes, hard to raise a B or a C right now unless you're profitable.
Irina, how did that? I'm not remembering what the round was that you just raised, but how does that resonate with the experience that Aaron had in its recent raise?
I mean, I think that's spot on. We're much later stage than that, and so I think for company, I think, again, investors have been sitting on their investments for quite some time. I think, as Tom said, the Series A with a low valuation, kind of not much of risk, but also not a huge outlay of capital, I think is one consideration. I think the companies that are closer to some sort of a liquidity event is another source of consideration. But I think the companies in the middle, it is an area of struggle, because I think investors want to, it continues to be an unknown for how long it'll take for them to see a return on their investment. And so unless there is a clear, as Tom said, unless there's a clear line of sight to revenue and to it's going to be hard for those companies to really sell themselves. I think certainly it's not impossible. I think, really interesting and innovative technologies and products and, kind of a very clear and concise story as to what that, the change in the market that will cause, I think will, certainly attract some investors, but it's just going to be a harder road.
Yeah, and I think in the summary is, 2024 was a rough year for raising around in device, in med tech. Hopefully that changes, and I think barbell's an interesting term, but there's always been a valley of death, for in that same area of companies, and there's different analogies. I think now the valley of death may have gotten a little wider. I think you're going to spend more time there. It's going to be harder to get through, and being capital efficient, finding non-dilutive funding. More and more disease foundations are filling the gap. And, and really traditional VC is in flux and family offices are moving in. It's a little more challenging. They're family offices, so they're not as consistent. You've got to deal with the families, but I think there are creative solutions to get funding out there. It doesn't make it easier. It certainly doesn't make it quicker. And, being an entrepreneur in medical device world is not for the faint of heart.
Had a question come in, two-part question. One is, can you address what KPIs investors are using for making investments into early stage product development companies? And the second part is more from the strategics perspective. Are they focusing more right now on internal product development or acquisition of tech? So KPIs for investors for making investments into MedTech companies, and are strategics building or buying? Toss that out to Irina. I'm not sure if you have a view on that.
I think Tom's probably better equipped to answer the KPI piece. I think on the strategics piece, I think it's a bit of both. I think, certainly there continues to be investment in R&D. But again, as we talked about earlier, I think there's more of an appetite to be acquisitive and to look at, buying the right asset. Again, whereas before, there was a lot of hesitancy and it was, big accretive deals. I think it's changed a little bit. I think there's still, the strategics are looking for companies that have a pathway again to being accretive. But if it's the right fit and it's the right company and they see that pathway, I think there's more of an appetite there.
For KPIs for very early stage companies, it's difficult to sort of share that barometer there, but it typically centers on what's the data that you're supplying, how differentiated and novel is your technology? Are you a Me Too device? Are you a minimally innovative product, or are you a totally new product category? So that is really sort of the first litmus test. And then from there, less so profitability, but more break-even status. So investors are pretty smart when they're saying, all right, if you have approval and you can sell, we need to get ourselves to earnings neutrality, because at that point we can run an M&A process, or private equity might take an interest, or we can facilitate some type of debt on top of the balance sheet. And I think for many entrepreneurs, that's an uncomfortable conversation, because it's not about doing a launch as fast as you can and as big as you can, but doing it much more strategically and saying, hey, once we have proof positive of uptake, now strategics can extrapolate value on their own. In terms of the, are strategics building or buying? They're doing both, always. There are going to be certain, and it's different for every strategic. And so I have a struggle when someone talks about strategics as this one block all doing the same things, because truly each one has their own strategies and their own plans. And so some are much more open to build to buy, like Edwards. Other groups are much more, we want to rely on our R&D teams, like Gore, for instance. And so that's where I think you get a little bit of differences too, by in between the strategics themselves.
I think the only other thing I'll mention is, Tom, you said, I think the market development piece, right? As far as KPI, in terms of looking at kind of what the pathway is to M&A, I think however we look at strategics, I think
Yep.
the one, I think the part that they want to, many of them want to see is a clearly developed market and kind of a pathway to commercialization, right? And so I think that a lot of the strategics are hesitant to buy a product where that pathway has not been laid out, and that, they're afraid of the market development play.
I couldn't agree more. It's all about market de-risking and that market access work for sure.
All right, thanks, everyone. I see Nicole joining back to wrap us up. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees for everything. And Nicole, I'll toss it back to you.
All right, awesome conversation. Obviously, we could keep going on. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for our speakers for sharing their expertise. Thank you to Greenberg Traurig for hosting today's conversation. And thank you for joining us live. We appreciate it. Please visit massmedic.com/events and check out all the other great events we have coming up. And we'll see you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.